In a previous video, we discussed looking at analysis by asking three interrogative questions, which were what, how, and why. And in this video, I want to take a deep dive into the what aspect. So if you remember from that last video, we were talking about how analysis involves complexity. In other words, there's a lot of different parts or pieces to the given thing that you're analyzing. And so that's where this question of what comes into play, right? We're asking, what do you notice? And there are a lot of things to notice, but the three big things that we often notice when doing analysis are components, relationships, and patterns. Let's first start talking about components. So components are the parts or the pieces of a given thing that you're inspecting. And this way you almost want to kind of think of yourself as like a detective, where you're inspecting and looking at and noticing different little smaller parts to a given thing. So for example, if you were doing a literature analysis, for instance, and you were analyzing a story, you might look at the characters, the setting, the plot, or the themes, right? That is you taking a story and then breaking it down into smaller components or parts. Another example of analysis might include, say you were going to analyze your cell phone, right? Well, you could break that down into parts. What are the parts of a cell phone? Well, we could break it down by the hardware, right? Or we could break it down by software or connectivity, right? But even within those, we can break those different things down even further. Like, what are some aspects or components or parts or pieces of hardware? Well, that could include things like your screen, your battery, storage, processor, your camera, right? Let's move on to our final two things that we notice, which are patterns and relationships. So relationships are how things connect or link together, and a pattern is how things usually recur or happen in a regular way. A relationship would be like knowing that your science class occurs before your math class. And a pattern would be like knowing that every weekend you're off of school. Now, there are different ways of describing the relationship between different parts or how parts affect and influence one another. But here are a few common relationships. So first we got cause and effect. This is like how one component or event directly influences another. An example of this could be like how a fire is caused by lighting a match. Another is correlation. This is when like two components tend to occur together or change in relation to one another. For instance, there's a relationship between height and shoe size that is best described as positively correlated. You know, it's often the case that as your height increases, so too does your shoe size. Another relationship is interdependence. This is when two or more things rely on each other to function or succeed. So you may have heard before that plants and bees have an interdependent relationship. In other words, the plants depend on bees for pollination, and bees need plants for nectar. Another relationship is called dependence, and this is when one element depends on another. For instance, a child depends on parents for care. Another final relationship that I want to talk about is hierarchy. This is the ranking of elements from most to least important, or vice versa. For example, in a company, hierarchy is the relationship between the different roles. You know, at the top is the CEO, who has the most authority and responsibility. Below the CEO are managers, who oversee various departments, and employees are below them. So finally, let's discuss patterns. Patterns are things that repeat or happen in a regular way and are often recognized by looking for the following types. So first is repetition. I think you know this one. This is something that happens again and again. Another one is trends. These are general directions in which something is developing or changing over time. For example, you might notice that technology is becoming more and more advanced every year. That's a trend. Another type of pattern is sequences. These are specific orders in which related events or elements follow each other. For example, in many board games, players take turns in a specific order. First player 1 goes, then player 2, and so on. Finally, the last pattern I want to talk about are themes. These are recurring ideas or topics that appear. For example, the theme of survival in a game like Pandemic, where constantly players face challenges related to disease or outbreaks. Okay, so let's put this all together for our baking cookies example. What are the components or parts of a cookie? Ingredients might include flour, sugar, butter, eggs, baking soda, and chocolate chips. Next, we could ask about relationships. How do the different ingredients relate to one another? Adding baking soda causes or makes the cookies rise. That's the effect. For patterns, we might notice that we need to follow certain steps in a certain order to achieve a desired result. First you cream the butter and sugar, then you add the eggs, followed by the dry ingredients. Or we might notice that chocolate chip cookies and peanut butter cookies follow similar patterns, but have different thematic elements in their flavor profile. And speaking of themes, it seems like the theme of this video is to really dive into the details. I hope you stayed with me. Thanks so much for joining.